My name is Neil Sharma. Welcome to another episode of our IGIE podcast. I'm joined today by two special individuals who are going to talk to us about Apollo, which is an endoscopic device that allows us to perform endoscopic suturing amongst other platforms. And so please, gentlemen, introduce yourselves and we'll jump right into the podcast.
I'll let Chas go first.
All right, thanks. So I'm Chas McKhann. Until very recently, I was the CEO of Apollo Endosurgery. I've been in the medical device business for 25 years or so and joined Apollo about 2.5 years ago. And so we'll talk in a minute about the founding of the company. I was not involved in that. I came in relatively late, but know all the founders and the individual folks involved. And it's a great story of all the work that went into it, but that's a little bit about me.
Excellent.
And I'm Brian Dunkin. I am the Chief Medical Officer for Boston Scientific's Endoscopy Division. I'm a general surgeon by background, also a therapeutic endoscopist, kind of combine those two things throughout my career, really looking at endoluminal surgery as the forefront of minimally invasive surgery. Professor of surgery for a while. My last stop was in Houston, Texas, and joined the company 4 years ago to head up their medical affairs division.
Excellent. So I've got to know Dr. Dunkin over a period of time and enjoyed working with him and being in labs with him. And I'm going to get an opportunity to learn and more about Chas here today. So I'm fairly familiar with the device and think rather highly of it, but let's take myself out of it. For those who have no exposure at all to Apollo Endosurgery, can you tell us a little bit about what is Apollo?
Sure. So I'll talk about the company and then our primary devices. So Apollo Endosurgery, until the recent acquisition by Boston Scientific, was a medical device company. The early roots of Apollo Endosurgery go back to a group called the Apollo Group that was founded in 1998 with Dr. C.J. Gostow, Sergei Kantovoy, Jay Pashrika, and others, who were really the early founders and pioneers in the area of NOTES, natural orifice surgery. And then the company was built from there. Our primary device is a suturing device, so endoscopic suturing, the overstitch device that many listeners will be familiar with. I'll talk a little bit, if we'd like, about the history around that, but it now has been on the market for about 10 years and has a wide range of applications in suturing in the GI tract. And then more recently, our X-Tac device, which is also a suture enclosure device as well. And as I said, until recently, a publicly traded company and now part of Boston Scientific.
Standing. And so as this device was first conceived, you said going back to 1998. So it's a long road as to how we got here and kind of where we are today with this common utilization, at least for those of us in the interventional endoscopy space. So can you talk a little bit about its conception and developments in the early stages?
Yeah, no, I will. It is a long road and a lot of just incredible innovation that went into it over many years. The original designs go back to the group I mentioned and Dr. Sidney Chung. The very first version of Overstitch was called the Eagle Claw. And it was the concept of an eagle's claw that got the curved needle that now is integral to the Overstitch device, for those who are familiar with it. They worked with Olympus, funded their research for many years. And it was, again, just a group of physicians doing primary research. The company was started in 2006. They recruited a CEO named Dennis McWilliams. And it really was a true startup at that stage. It was Dennis and a couple of engineers working out of a coffee shop, in Austin, Texas in 2006. They were able to get some venture capital funding, started really the development. And at the time, they had big aspirations to have a whole portfolio of tools to support NOTES, as I mentioned. But two things happened in the late 2000s. The first is the FDA changed their regulatory pathways and made it a lot more challenging to bring new technologies to market within the NOTES. They changed it from a 510K to a PMA pathway. For those who are familiar with the regulatory pathways, PMA pathways are much more challenging in terms of what they were looking for in terms of the amount of data. So that also increases the expense of a lot of new technologies. And then in addition, we had the recession that happened in 2008, 2009. So funding really dried up. And so Dennis will tell you there were a couple of near-death experiences for the company. This is pretty common with medical device startups. And it really forced them and their investors at the time to focus, and the focus was on Overstitch. And so the first device came out in 2009. It was a Gen 1 device that we've got versions of it back at our offices. That it's a big, unwieldy device. You have to have hands like a Sergei Kantsevoy to be able to actually even use it. But it proved proof of concept. It proved it could work. And then they got working on, the Gen 2 version that was eventually cleared in 2011, and that's the standard dual channel overstitch that people are familiar with today. So, but you can see a 10 to 15 year timeline of the work, even just to get to, and we've been innovating since then, but just to get the first usable device to market.
So Chaz, just incorporating yourself and your personal experience into this, have you worked with a lot of device companies before? And just tell me a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I started my career at the consulting firm McKinsey & Company. We did a lot of work with pharma and device companies. I then was at Johnson & Johnson and Boston Scientific. Launched primarily in the cardiology space is where I started. Launched the very first coronary drug-eluting stent. Launched and worked on cardiac rhythm management devices, so pacemakers and defibrillators. But for the last almost 15 years, I've been in more startup kinds of and emerging growth kinds of companies. I was the chief commercial officer at Thorax Medical, who made the Lynx device, and chief commercial officer at a company called Intersect ENT that had a bioabsorbable drug-eluting stent for the nose after sinus surgery. So I really enjoy working with and developing new technologies that really incorporate the clinical aspect, reimbursement, the regulatory pieces, all the different things that need to come together to develop new therapies.
And how did you stumble upon Apollo, or did they recruit you? How did you get involved with them?
Yeah, so in those early days of Apollo, the original investor, one of the original investors, was a group called PTV Sciences out of Austin, Texas, and a venture capital firm whose principal at the time was a guy named Rick Anderson. Rick is an old boss of mine at Cordis. But he's been involved at J&J, but he's been involved with Apollo since the very early days, was still on the board when they were recruiting for a new CEO 3 years ago, and called me up. And the company had a lot of ups and downs, a long history, as I mentioned. But I really felt like there were great technologies, very good people, very loyal customers who loved the device, and that there was just a great opportunity. And I think that proved to be the case over the last couple of years.
Do you find the trajectory that you mentioned, so it's 10, 15-year timeline? I'm sure there's other people who listen to our podcast or follow the IGA journal. And a big part of the journal, or at least the vision from our editor-in-chief, Chris, was to talk about innovation, to understand industry and that juxtaposition, especially in a space like interventional endoscopy, where we're so device reliant. And I think the devices and technology are helping us fulfill what our goals are for our patients in terms of minimally invasive, low morbidity surgical options for patients. Do you find this trajectory is a common trajectory? Can you talk about Apollo's trajectory? And is that something that we should expect if we have an interest in developing a device?
There are a lot of factors that go into the trajectory for new technologies and medical devices. This one took a long time. Frankly, there were some missteps by the company along the way too. Many know that the Apollo acquired the lap band. That was not a successful acquisition. They since sold it off, but became quite a distraction. So that contributed. But also, you really need to, for those who are interested in developing new technologies and commercializing new technologies, you've got to be very thoughtful about all of the different elements around training, around reimbursement, around general market adoption and developing users. A big mistake a lot of companies make is to try to train a lot of people and focus more on the number of people who are trained versus how much are people really using it, and how are they using it, and what's the patient outcome. It always should come down to how are you getting the best possible patient outcomes. And I personally would much rather have a smaller number of people using a product, but using it a lot and really having great outcomes, and then build from there. And so we can all play Monday morning quarterback and say, how could we have done it a little bit faster? But ultimately now Overstitch is a very widely used device that has gained a lot of traction, but it took a long time.
So I think just a couple of pearls perhaps from that is having a good focus for the company, not being too diversified early, is one particular item, and then the user space, getting people really engaged, well, versatile, and able to do it in a proficient manner that shows the efficacy of the product. Sounds like it's another one that's really integral as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, those are good summaries.
Yeah. And so talk a little bit about that early device. You went from 1.0 to 2.0. What were the things that you need to change in terms of an engineering standpoint or device development standpoint to make it what we're utilizing today, which I would say is a very useful device that goes over a double channel scope for those who have not utilized it. I know that in our interventional practice, we utilize it on a regular basis. I mean, honestly, there's very few days that we're not doing some form of suturing, whether it's suturing stents, suturing perforations, cerclaging down openings for gastric outlet reduction. There's a myriad of applications I think we're stumbling upon even more and more. But how do you get through that engineering roadblock?
Yeah, no, so the Gen 1 device was a very big and kind of unwieldy device. The business end of it was quite similar to what we ended up with, but just the specific gears evolved with it had not been refined yet. So it was a big device, difficult to use. It was also incredibly expensive to produce and manufacture. And so it would not have been a commercially viable device. And so it did take about 3 years to move from that first generation device to the one that you're familiar with. And that took a lot of engineering time and just iteration and working with physicians on usability testing and trying new designs. And ultimately got to a good outcome there. We also have developed a single channel version that was launched and approved in late 2018, I think, was when the SX was first, but similarly, probably a suboptimal product and not what we needed. And the company, and Brian can speak to this, is very close to getting the FDA clearance for a new single channel device, which we think is going to be a step change improvement in performance there. But again, you could look and say that was a 4 to 5 year process, partly because of resource availability and areas of focus of the company, but also a lot of engineering went into, we need to have a higher functioning single channel product. And I'm excited with the one that's going to be coming out here in the second half of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I remember seeing the SX, and I'm sure all of us are excited to see a single channel platform that would be more widely applicable and perhaps useful in smaller spaces, right?
Yep,
That would be
that's the
great.
entire idea, and I'm excited. The team it started off the project, and this is one of the first things I greenlighted when I came in and really put focus attention on. And it started off with let's just kind of fix the issues with SX, but over time morphed into let's really improve functionality in some key areas. And so it's not cleared yet, so we can't get into all the details around the product, but except that it's going to be a big step up in terms of performance and applicable on single channel devices. So a lot of excitement about that once it is cleared.
Is this where you think the original founders were hoping to go with the company, or was there just a wide array, as you mentioned, of some things that maybe are outside of the space of Overstitch itself right now? Can you talk a little bit about how the founders were conceptualizing all of this, and are they, maybe happy with where things are today?
It's a great question. I think in the early days, there was a much wider lens of the kinds of things they could be working on and a vision of doing many more procedures through the stomach, right? Through natural orifice surgery. And, you had, so the No Scar group was founded by some of the same principles here, and adding in guys like Lee Swanstrom and others who had visions of doing, a whole broad range of procedures through the natural orifice. They were probably years ahead of their time. Some of the things that they are talking about or were thinking about then are now starting to come into fruition. I do think that the endoscopic bariatric applications that we can now do based off of recent approvals with Overstitch and the merit study for ESG procedures is part of the vision they had. But there are other applications as well. And so I think they're happy with what we've achieved, but always could say a little bit of what ifs in terms of other applications that had the FDA pathways been a little more friendly or more money involved. But you always have those when you're developing new technologies.
Where do you think, or at what time frame do you think that the device became popular? I mean, I can say I was probably using it starting right coming out of Interventional Fellowship 2013, but I don't know that the rest of the world popularized or found this device in their hands as quickly. Was there a certain time frame or trajectory where you saw use cases or user groups going up significantly?
Sure, I'm happy to give you my perspective, and then Brian can chime in from his personal experience a little bit. from a company standpoint, it was, I think, a pretty targeted burn in the early days of building within and very good support from a lot of academic institutions, which you like to see, right? In terms of,
Right.
places like Mayo and Brigham and Women's and Johns Hopkins and others who really did incorporate it into what they did day to day, and develop a lot of different applications. Overstitch is a tool. It's a tool that enables a lot of things. And you mentioned suturing in the esophagus or in the stomach and different applications for it. And then specific applications I mentioned, like the bariatric applications, which really, physicians initiated that and started collecting data. And we initially had 1 year data and then 2 year data. And then now there is some 5 year data. We needed to do a randomized trial specifically for that to be able to promote it as a new indication, and did complete that with the merit study. So all of these things built. And I would say, by the late, 2010s, as it were, 2018, 2019, it was really starting to grow. And then we saw in the last 2 years since I joined, the overall revenues for the company grew over 50% over that period. And most of it was Overstitch. And by the way, that was globally, right? Apollo is a very global organization. And so we've got a lot of users in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Europe, and we're working on the pathways in places like Japan and China and others. So, it's a very global approach and company, and I think that's absolutely continuing to Boston Scientific as well.
So I'll ask Dr. Dunkin to chime in. So as the revenues grow and the user base grows as well, Boston Scientific obviously had some interest, and here we are today. So can you talk to me a little bit about how that went? I think both from your clinical lens in terms of seeing more people understand the technology and where it can be applied, and the applications have grown significantly, but then also from a business standpoint in terms of acquisition.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And I'd say a couple of things. One, just to piggyback a little bit on Chaz's description of the trajectory here and kind of the development of the technology. I think it's important for viewers to understand that, from my perspective anyway, developing endoscopic suturing was not just a pure technology development. It really was a definition of the technique, the principles, taking things from kind of the surgical domain and bringing them into the endoluminal domain, and figuring out how to deploy that at the end of the endoscope. So kudos to Apollo for not only in a really amazing way advancing the technology. I used the Gen 1 device. I don't think I used it clinically, but I was in Houston at the time, so not far from Austin, Texas, where the headquarters was, and had a research lab in Houston. So we were working with the device in the lab. Amazing step up in kind of the quality of device, the elegance of it, its applicability to go from that Gen 1 to Gen 2. And then hopefully you're going to see the same kind of step up with the next generation as well. But really was a combination of that technology, and then really, how do you suture? Like, how do you do that in an endoluminal space? As far as kind of, Boston Scientific's interest, it's not a new interest in Apollo for sure. We've kept an eye on Apollo for probably 10 years, on and off through their timeline. All of the world events that Chaz described, kind of impact business development. But boy, talk about the right place at the right time, right? If you think about what's happened just in the last 24 months with the FDA clearance of both the ESG system and the TORI system, adding XTAC to the armamentarium, and then the merit trial to show the value of this technology in a new space. That's what makes it attractive. Boston Scientific is very committed, the endoscopy division, to the endoluminal surgery space. We would say that's getting surgical type results using an endoluminal approach. That's actually a philosophy that spans all of the divisions in the company, whether that's cardiac or neuromodulation or peripheral interventions or in the endoscopy or urology space. And in order to impact that space, you need a toolbox. You need a toolbox like a surgeon has tools on their back table in the operating room to do different things. And tissue closure is foundational to that. So this was the perfect acquisition to help us to continue to build out that toolbox for the endoluminal surgery space. It also gives us what we've been terming a measured approach into the endoluminal bariatric space. This is, for our company, a newer space to us. There's a lot to learn. I'm currently at a national meeting on bariatrics right now to listen and learn more. We have a lot of respect for that kind of specialty, if you will. We have a lot of respect for what Apollo has done so far. We want to leverage all of that and then bring kind of the power of a multinational corporation like Boston Scientific to help accelerate this trajectory for this technology. So I hope that answers some of your questions, but it's a really exciting addition to the endoluminal surgery portfolio for Boston Scientific.
Absolutely. From your clinical perspective, so watching surgery change, right, with a period of time, everything going from open down to laparoscopic, now robotics are extremely popular, and then endoscopic, as you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about that approach, and where do you think we are in terms of that development process? Are we in the beginning of that development process? Obviously, the acquisition signs that it's moving forward, but just kind of give me just a better understanding of where that space is.
Yeah, I would argue that we're like right in the middle of the endoluminal surgery revolution, if you will, or evolution, I should say. Really, we've moved from open to laparoscopic / minimally invasive, and that's included the robotic paradigm as well. And then we've been moving very diligently into really what I consider the next generation of minimally invasive surgery, and that's the endoluminal space. And Neil, I think of it a little bit broadly. Therapeutic endoscopists are doing things in the hepatobiliary and pancreas space under ultrasound guidance and with needle acquisitions and other technologies that really do replace what we did surgically not so long ago. The third space of endoscopy as well, with POEM and POP and Z-POEM and some of the more advanced mucosal resections with advanced EMR and ESD, that's all an example of endoluminal surgery. And then to take this further with having more advanced tissue closure capability, particularly with suturing, and then the X-Tack platform coupled with our clip platforms, allows you to do more advanced tissue resection, get to full thickness closure, modify the GI tract in a way that we do for a gastroplasty. So I think we're in the heart of it. I mean, I cataloged for a colleague not too long ago, I think at least a dozen procedures that used to be done preferentially with surgery just within the time period of my career and now are done preferentially endoscopically. It's why I picked up those skills in my own surgical practice early in my training. And it's why I encourage whether you're a therapeutic endoscopist coming from the gastroenterology world or whether you're a surgeon wanting to do less invasive surgery, you need to pick up these skills and be part of this movement.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I appreciate the summary. I think it's helpful for people to see the broad perspective of where the technology is going. And it's important to see all sides, I think, in terms of where the applications can go in the future. And it's a really exciting time in endoscopy, right? Because we've seen this revolution happen in maybe some other fields. A great example would probably be cardiology, and where interventional cardiology has been able to go in terms of making a major impact on the patients in morbidity and cost being reduced significantly, as well as really getting ahead of how they can impact that disease state. And I think we're on the precipice, or perhaps, as you said very eloquently, in the middle of where that evolution can go. So that kind of leaves us with the last potential considerations. We're all about innovation at the journal and thinking ahead. So where are the next steps? I know you can't share everything as a company, just acquiring another company, but just dream. It can be off the cuff. Where do you think it'll go? Maybe Chas, you go first, and then Dr. Dunkin. I'd love to hear kind of where you think this could go, or spitball some crazy concepts to us.
So my response is going to be a little different than technologically where can it go next, but more building what Brian just said. Because you mentioned, Neil, the cardiologists. And one of the things that the interventional cardiologists do incredibly well, and that's where I kind of grew up in my career in the medical device industry, is identify the emerging procedures and then really coordinate their efforts around them. And I especially mean things like guidelines, coding, coverage, payment, all of the different elements that need to come together to develop a therapy. because I get the sense sometimes that the GIs think once they have the technology in the initial cases that they're kind of done.
Right.
And from a business standpoint, you're just beginning. And so the one thing I would encourage the viewers and audience to really think about, especially people in positions of leadership, are which are the procedures and technologies that really have the potential to have the biggest impact, and what are all of the different elements that need to come together to make it move from, the very early days to kind of emerging adoption, which is where I think we are in the endobariatric, to truly mainstream. And I think you've got a number of them. I mean, Brian just listed off a bunch, but similarly with some of the coding challenges that have happened with ESD is another example, right? Having concerted effort to get the right codes in place, really working on the coverage side with payers, getting the right guidelines in place, all of that, I think, creates the sort of backbone to make all of these other elements that maybe Brian will talk about come to fruition. And so that's where I think there should be a really big focus and tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of work to be done in general, whether you're talking about endoluminal bariatrics or just kind of this closure space. I do think that we're moving into an era where people are going to need to have tools on the shelf at the ready in order to manage more advanced tissue resection, perforations, complications from procedures, that kind of thing. And so that's ongoing. That's kind of steadily growing. I think as Boston Scientific, we do some things well in this space. One of them is around education. And so we really want to be able to help more people get their suturing skills and their ability to do advanced tissue closure and take advantage of this technology. On the endoluminal bariatric and metabolic side, as Chas just said, there's a lot of work to do. This to me, it feels like it's an early promising procedure. When you talk about things like ESG or TORI, they need the right stewardship. And they need that on multiple levels. They need it from the clinical level. So the clinical community needs to do the science and the work to figure out where these fit in, how they bring value to our patients, how they stack up against other types of technology, so that you can have a patient-centered approach to what do I pull off the shelf to apply to this patient in front of me. We need to be able to have a paradigm where patients have access to the technology. So that's coding, that's reimbursement, that's coverage, all the things that patients require to be able to have access to this in a broad way, so that we can have a meaningful impact on the world. I will say that the bariatric and metabolic space right now really is at a revolutionary time in its kind of trajectory, if you will. We've developed surgeries that are effective, and those surgeries continue to mature and get better with time. Medicines have come to the fore now and are starting to grow, and we're figuring out the place for those to be. Endoluminal applications like ESG with the overstitch device, like it's a really exciting time to impact really a worldwide pandemic, if you will, of bariatric and metabolic disease. And it's exciting to have more and more tools to bring to bear for our patients. It's also exciting that patients are starting to recognize this as the disease that it is, and to start seeking solutions for it, and solutions that might start more with their mindset of where they're ready to start. So that might start with medicine and then progress to a procedure. But we're getting more and more people to come into the fold, if you will, to seek medical consultation and to really try to change the trajectory of this disease. And that's a really exciting time. So lots of work to do. And we're excited to help do that work through Boston Scientific.
Well, I appreciate the both of you sharing some time with me, sharing your personal experiences, letting people know everything from, how do you develop a concept around a device to get to a device, and then certainly how the broad applications of this device can grow. I think this is a really exciting time. I can feel the energy just from us talking about interventional endoscopy as a whole, and in specific, how our ability to close tissues, and closure is such a big part. as Dr. Duncan mentioned, relevant to being able to successfully perform a procedure and have that safety in your hand to be able to know that you can close it out at the very end. And Apollo has really changed the landscape for those of us who are practicing interventional endoscopy. I'm excited to see where it will go. And hopefully those who are watching today will have some great ideas for new devices that will help us revolutionize the space and help a lot of patients. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you.